Hey, well, hi everyone. My name is Noel Rankin. I am the GTA for the Teaching and Learning Center. Don is on his way to his office. He had another meeting this morning, but he will be joining us in just a couple of minutes. But welcome everyone. It's so good to see you. As a reminder, you've arrived to our professional development series. If you attend enough of these events, you might be eligible for a professional development certificate or a fellowship if you're a faculty member. And I've provided that link in the chat if any of you want to check that out. We usually always kind of remind everyone of what's coming next in our series. So on March 22nd, the Wednesday after spring break, Melissa Glacier will be presenting an event entitled More Than Kindness, Practical Ways to Support Students with Empathy and Boundaries. But today we are super excited to have Colby Moorberg and Brian Lindshield presenting Teaching Without Prepackaged Course Materials, Open Educational Resources, and Open Pedagogy. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Brian and Colby. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of set the stage for kind of what led to Colby and I proposing this as the session for today. And then I will share now that I do teach at 12:30. And so Colby is going to be facilitating, as I slip out, to go be able to help do that. My students have a review today for an exam Friday. And so since we're all focused on student success, I couldn't really justify, not being there, for my students and things today to hopefully help set them up to be successful. But what kind of Colby and I went back and forth on is this blog post, by David Wiley. It's titled, Faculty are losing interest in adopting OER. And so it's based off a Ithaca S&R US faculty survey. There's some data in it. I'm not going to go through it all, but one of the things that does kind of help reemphasize this point is, what you see right here is this data, which the lighter blue is 2018, the darker blue is 2021. And so you can see that in general, the trends are that there's decline in interest in using and creating OER and things of what they found, at least in this national survey that they did. So that's coupled with that, I have a colleague that works with LibreText, Delmar Larson, and so he texted this out shortly after that point in time. And so this is looking at consumer price index for all urban consumers, so educational books and supplies in the US city average. And so this has been something that's been used for OER for a number of years because it was the one that everybody was citing on that it was increasing at this rate greater than the consumer price index or the CPI and things for a number of periods of time. But we reached a point in time where it actually plateaued, as you saw here. But then what he was kind of pointing out is, did anybody recognize or anybody have much reason why that the note that this has started to increase, again, here now after the years of plateau. And so that would be consistent with this issue. And so going back to the blog post, David Wiley kind of posits that maybe one of the reasons why that this is something that is happening is that people are not, or faculty and instructors are not comfortable teaching without the prepackaged or course materials comes along with a textbook. And so that kind of led us to our session here today. And so what we kind of envision for this is it to be relatively informal and interactive. And I did invite some other, educators who we have here at K-State. And so they're probably going to share their sort of perspectives and experiences on this as well. And we hope that there's going to be questions and interaction kind of around, that sort of aspect on how do the different people in different disciplines do this is kind of what I hope we're going to be able to set up the stage today. So Colby, I kind of did that there. Do you want to maybe start with how you kind of feel like you approach this aspect of teaching without the prepackaged materials? And then maybe I can hear from my perspective, and then we can start seeing some other people and answer questions and have interaction that way.
All right. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I'm going to post a couple links in the chat. Let's get a quick copy on here real quick. 1 second. So I'll give you some background. So my one of the classes that I teach, like the primary course for my appointment, is an introductory soil science class, and we typically have around 100 students, give or take some, in the enrolled in the course every semester. And when I started at K-State, the lab manual was actually more expensive than the textbook that was required for the class. It costs like $165 for the lab manual, and the textbook itself was like $135, $140. And I thought both were were way too much. And so the lab manual is actually kind of what put me on the path towards open textbooks. Now I know with the commercial textbook that is the dominant textbook used in intro to soils classes, there's also a lab manual that's associated with that, as well as other teaching materials like PowerPoints and like PowerPoints that go along with all the same figures that are from the textbook and so on. And so as a whole, there's a package that people could presumably adopt and basically kind of step into like a kind of a pre-made set of slides they can use for lectures, and there's assignments and lab exercises and so on. And I think in a lot of ways, people sort of like that scenario where, yeah, it might cost the students money, but it makes it easier on the instructor to just kind of take all these prepackaged things and just go with it. Now I wanted to replace a lab manual that was not associated with the commercial textbook that we're using in the class at the time. So I switched to this lab manual that I had adapted from an open textbook that was used at North Carolina State. And since we've modified it, with now version 2.0, which you guys have the link to, that version is used by, I think, 180 different instructors from around the world. So obviously there's demand for this sort of supplementary material like lab manuals, or it could even be maybe like pre-made slides and so on. But that's sort of the concept we're thinking about, like not necessarily like the textbook itself, but like the stuff that helps kind of create the environment that the students are learning in. So developing that lab manual, it took a lot of effort on my part. It was not at all something where you just like step into it and it's ready to go from day one. It did take some time to adapt everything and get it to the point where it could be published and ready to use, at least to my liking, for the students. So that's kind of one approach that I've used. Now I'm working on a new lab manual for a different course, and in that case, let me get that link up for you. So we have a draft that's in Pressbooks right now, and that book, I actually developed it as part of developing an online version of my soil and water conservation class, and actually use a lot of content that was already sort of developed but not put into like a laboratory manual format. So we use some materials that are the Natural Resources Conservation Service has used for on-site assessment of soil health. And then also some materials that have been put together for different models that are used for that class. And what I was basically doing is kind of curating all that, all those materials into one place, and then putting it in the context of like a lab activity. So the students can kind of read through everything, do the activity, get it all done in a 3-hour period, and then kind of move on to the next week's activity. So in both cases, it took some work on my end to kind of get things ready to go. But as I think about future projects, like developing an overall open textbook for my soils class, that is one thing I'm thinking about, is the kind of developing a whole environment where people get like the full package of materials. But yeah, I guess I didn't sell the point, Brian, that this is easy to do. In my case, I kind of took the hard route, but I think there is demand. There's clearly demand for kind of associated materials that can be used for the teaching environment.
Yeah, I think it's important though for us to be honest, you know what I mean, with people though, about kind of what it will take, you know what I mean, in some cases like this. And so at least I can share in my perspective that if you are going to do this, lots of times it means that you're going to probably be creating PowerPoints, you know, in some way, which maybe if you got a textbook, you know, that you adopt, you know, from a textbook company that might have that, you know what I mean, you have like a deck, you know what I mean, and things you can start to work from. If you're going to do an OER, you're probably going to be looking at developing, you know, the PowerPoints that go along with that. And so that's going to take a little bit of time. But I guess from my mindset, a lot of times I think about it's usually a big one-time effort, you know what I mean, is what I would say for some of these sorts of materials and things. And so I don't know that it fundamentally adds a lot more time, you know what I mean, as you go out through your teaching and things, and it does probably give you more flexibility in how you want to pedagogically teach your students and things. But it usually is not like a repeated effort. And so if you make the PowerPoints, you're probably going to revise those, but you're not going to be like creating them all over again, you know, as kind of what an example is. Or in my case, you know, and also I know Colby and I gave a presentation on this last year, 2 years ago, and I think it was something titled like Rome wasn't built in a day. And so you kind of have to think about, you know, your teaching in that sort of perspective as well, with these resources that support your course. If you are moving away from the textbook, is that you're going to continue to add things and be able to kind of refine those to help support, you know, your course and things. But it is possible. And I guess I can share, and you know, I'm part of, I think many people hopefully know that I'm part of the Open Alternative Textbook Initiative. Is this something you want to do? We're privileged here at K-State that we have, you know, that's available, that we will provide support, you know, financially to help support you in doing that. And we love, and I know I see some of my colleagues with the initiative on today. And so we'd love, you know, to have you reach out to us so we can help support you. And if it is a big one-time effort, it helps to support you financially so that you are receive financial support, you know, for the time you invest in doing that. But then hopefully you see benefits, and then students see benefits, you know, for a longer period of time beyond, you know, what that initial effort is and things. And so I guess I'd say that's how I kind of view it. I don't know that I need to go into a lot of detail on specific sorts of things that I do, because we have other people, you know, that can kind of share, you know, what but that's how I view it, is that it's going to take time. And so teaching takes time, as most everyone here knows, if you're going to do it well. And so it's going to be a one-time effort. You know what I mean? It's going to go into some of these sorts of activities. And then the other thing that, you know, I will share is that the OER platforms are continuing to evolve and improve. And so there is more capability now to do some of these sorts of things beyond, you know, just an OER itself. So there are platforms available now that allow you to create questions that you can embed in your OER, work with OER and things, where in the past those were not available. And so again, those are things that we'd welcome people reaching out, you know, to us, so we can provide more information, you know, about those sorts of things, if that's something you do have an interest in or would help you in your teaching. So
I think there's one more aspect we should touch on as well, and that is open pedagogy. So just by a show of hands, for those that have their cameras on, who's heard of the term open pedagogy before? All right, so quite a few people. So for those that haven't, in a nutshell, what it means is teaching in a way where the students themselves become the teachers, or the content creators. And so I have one more link that I'm going to put in the chat here. And the textbook that we use for my soil and water conservation class is actually an annotated bibliography, where over the course of 2 offerings of the in-person version of the course, the students all were assigned individual topics where they went out and found resources that were freely available online. They might not necessarily be openly licensed, but they were freely available online. And they took those, developed an annotation, and then as a class, we kind of put that together into sort of a chapter and section format of a textbook. But instead of regular textbook content, it's an annotated bibliography. And in that case, I was having the students learn in the process, but and sort of teaching themselves and each other. But in the end, we create content that can be used by future offerings of the course and future students, as well as people outside the class. And I think the open pedagogy approaches can actually be a good way to sort of lessen the time demand that it takes to create open content. So if it's something that you, so people in the comments are saying no throwaway assignments, exactly. So it's a good way to develop content that if we just went that process solo, it'd be a lot more work on our part, but it actually makes for a nice assignment for the students in the process. All right, so Carolyn asks, as your OER has been shared in the wider OER community, have you seen other instructors develop and share ancillary materials? So in my case, I've had, I tried to develop sort of a library where we have a shared Google Drive where people can access all the materials related to my lab manual. And I have created folders for one other person so far that actually took that lab manual and adapted it for soils specific to their region or their state. So yes, I've had that, but it hasn't happened to the extent that I had hoped it would. So I think people are just happy with the quality that is currently offered, and they don't really want to reinvent the wheel, I guess.
So Colby, are you okay with us maybe calling on some other OER instructors to
Yeah.
see their
Sounds good.
So Andy, I see you have your camera on, so I can know that you're ready, hopefully. So Andy, can you share kind of, you know, your discipline and background and kind of what your experience has been in this?
Yeah, so I'm in modern languages. I teach Spanish and our second language pedagogy course. And so for our second language pedagogy course, there's a great OER on language teaching methods that I use as my primary source for the students in that class. I like it a lot because it's very interactive. And so there are videos that show different like teaching techniques, videos where they video like a classroom. And so it's a class and the students are participating and they get a lot of information being taught like as if they're one of the students in the class. But then there's also text that has links to other sources and whatnot. At this point, it's from 2010. And so I'm starting to get like, ooh, like there's been some advances and I might need to adapt at some point soon, which is the kind of the downside of OER. But it's really nice because I've been able to just like adopt that without adapting it at all. I use a couple supplementary materials of my own, but for the most part, like that's our base text and students can always access it wherever they are. They don't need to be carrying around a book with them. I've also created OER materials for our Spanish 4 class, and that was due to textbooks for basic Spanish classes tend to be like for a very broad audience and therefore like lack any kind of interesting content. Like they're watered down and bland because they're trying to appeal to everybody. And for our course here, I wanted to have something that appealed specifically to students in Kansas. And so the focus of the materials that I created are on Spanish in Kansas, the Great Plains, and the United States, and how we interact with different cultures, different countries, and immigrants that come here. And so that was really more out of, that one's been a lot more work, obviously. So to what Colby was saying, it's not easy, but it also is a lot more gratifying and allows me to teach the material that I actually want to teach rather than being kind of trying to figure out how to make a textbook interesting and relevant to my students. So that's kind of been my journey and experience thus far. Yeah, I don't know if there's any questions or we can move on to somebody else's experience.
Are you using any certain platforms or anything, Andy, for some of the sorts of work you're doing or not? And how's that?
Yeah, so for the Spanish 4, last year I piloted the materials just using PDFs. So I created the materials and just to see how it would work, I would upload the PDFs on Canvas, kind of make sure that the materials were working for us. And now that we're at that, we feel like we're good with the materials. I've been putting everything into Pressbooks. And so I'm by the fall, that Pressbooks will be ready to use with our class. And I've been also creating H5P activities that the students can do so that it's an interactive text that students can read a text or watch a video and then respond to questions and they get immediate feedback on how they did. And so, oh, thanks for the link. So there's a little bit of a learning curve with H5P. I have an advantage that I used it at a previous institution where we created our own materials using a WordPress base. So I have a little bit of experience already in creating those. So it takes a little bit of time, but it is fantastic once you have the materials there and ready. The students get immediate feedback, and so they can see kind of how they're doing, if they're getting the answers right, if they're understanding. And then we have class time based for more discussion and kind of diving a little bit deeper into the things that they learned about in the press books or in the materials themselves.
Great, thank you for sharing, Andy. And so, yeah, I put the H5P link in there. I also have a bunch of H5P used in my course, as well. There are, like I said, the platforms are getting better. So there are other assessment, options, available. I'm not, that's a whole thing, what I mean, to go down, all the different sort of question options. H5P is probably the simplest, I guess I would say. But there are some limitations on like what sorts of things you're doing. It depends on what your assessment strategy is and things, but I agree it's working well, for my specific sort of use of it and things, but there are some other options available. So let's see. Who else has their camera on? So
we've had Andy's Spanish example. Kathleen, you want to talk about French? Keep on the language theme here.
So I actually have a question for the group. So what's going to be happening for us in the fall? We're adapting an open access resource for French 1. That means that it's going to be taught by graduate student instructors, by GTAs. And so I was wondering if anyone here is a GTA who's currently teaching with an OER, or if anyone is supervising GTAs who are teaching with an OER, because that's something I've never done before. And I think to what we were talking about with ancillary materials, traditional textbooks contain a lot of ancillary teaching materials, which can be useful for GTAs because, they haven't taught very many times before. And so I just wanted to hear if anyone had any tips about using OER with GTAs, or if any GTAs had experiences that they wanted to share.
So I do, Kathleen, I guess. I'm supervising a GTA right now, who's doing that, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. We've been developing the OER while the GTA is teaching with it. And so what you guys have is far beyond, where we were at. It was more, we had like 11 different OERs that we kind of Frankenstein pieces, together, and then we're adapting. And so we've been working through that process, and so I have to go get ready to teach my class, but yeah, we can definitely connect. You know what I mean? If you want to hear, and I can connect you with the GTA and she could talk about, what that experience like. I'm fortunate that GTA has a good background, in what she's doing, I guess, and things. And so that's been very helpful. So.
So my lab manual that I use is also taught for the most part with GTAs as well. So I think that the format that I use, where each lab activity starts with an introduction, I think that introduction actually gives kind of a nice overview that the GTAs can actually use at the start of each lab period to kind of give the students a refresher on that particular topic. So in some ways, depending how it's formatted, it can actually kind of help them kind of pace out what they need to actually get across during the laboratory period, if it is a lab. So I don't know if it's any different than a commercial textbook, I guess. What I have found is that GTAs are actually really helpful for helping find any sort of typos or things that are unclear as I go through like revisions on the different projects that I've worked on. So that part's definitely helpful. Probably more so for me than them, but yeah. Anyone else have any comments on GTAs and OER?
I just would say that just because you're not using a textbook with your students doesn't mean that you can't give GTAs old textbooks that you've used in other classes that had just to kind of be like, okay, so if this is the topic, here's another textbook that covers similar types of topics, and kind of, if you can find some additional, I know that I have stacks of Spanish textbooks. And so for me, it's not hard to be like, here, take some of these, feel free to use those activities in class. And giving that extra support there.
Kathleen, did you have any other French examples, I guess, on the language theme?
In French, we're using LibreText, which also is H5P compatible. And it seems like that's the one that the state of Kansas, that the Board of Regents is the most excited about in some ways. And so that's what we've been using. And but I think it's similar to Pressbooks in a lot of ways. So I don't think I have anything else to add beyond that.
All right. So there's a question in the chat. So it says, so for those of us brand new to thinking about this possibility and the development for a course, where do we start? So yeah, it's a good question. Actually, where I started was talking to the librarians in the Center for the Advancement of Digital Scholarship. So that's always a good place to start, is talking to librarians. I'll give them a nice plug there. I learned a lot from that, just from like those conversations, and trying to figure out like what was actually possible within copyright law for open textbooks, and kind of what the process would be, what support there is for platforms like Pressbooks or LibreText. So that would probably be my starting point. And I think beyond that, they would probably be able to find or recommend faculty that maybe have related courses or related ideas to kind of give you some ideas for conversations and stuff. Good question. So I see Eva Horn is here, and she teaches biology. This is one of several biology faculty at K-State. So I kind of like to hear some input from her about teaching without without commercial textbooks.
Yeah, and we've actually been doing it for, I don't know, probably 20 years now. It's been a long time that we switched. We went to OER back when OpenStax first started. And we started with OpenStax, and we started with a biology textbook that was already on OpenStax. Pardon my sonic grenades here, they're being a little obnoxious. And we just took that material and edited it and made it our own, and rearranged the chapters and changed some of the text. And now that OpenStax has changed a lot of what they do, we actually recently just downloaded the whole thing and put it in Word and edited it even more. We reduced the content a lot because there was a lot of extra stuff in there that we didn't actually cover in classes, which is the same argument we have with students with using commercial textbook. That's the stuff that doesn't get covered. And so we took a lot of that out, and we are now providing it as PDFs through Canvas. So that's their textbook now. Our studio manual, we created that and have been having it published through smaller publishing groups, and it's sold by the graduate students in biology. So it comes in a lot cheaper than what it would be if it went through a commercial kind of publishing house. And then the grad students get some funds for that too. For the online class, the Principles Online, we don't even have a studio manual. I incorporated a lot of the questions in that they work through in the studio manual in the in-person class. A lot of those questions are embedded in the computer material. So as they work through concepts and processes and things, they have questions about that they have to answer, or their activities that they have to do. But that was using that software called Articulate Storyline that allows you to do some pretty fancy things. But you can embed questions with, I believe LibreText does that now. So there are other ways that you can do that kind of thing now. And we're currently thinking about moving our studio manual to an open source online thing. The problem with putting our studio manual open source is that it's very specific to how we teach the course. So it's not something that someone else could use unless they do exactly the same sorts of things that we do. So I don't know if that will ever become completely open source, but the textbook that e-text with the PDFs that we have now, I would love to go back to putting that up as open source. Because there's things in there that are not available in some of the open source textbooks, and some of them actually have mistakes and things in them that we've corrected. So that's something that we're looking at doing in the future, but we're waiting. We've got a few things going on with biology that need to be decided before we decide exactly which direction we're going to go with that. So I don't know if that helped or not.
Yeah. One thing I do want to mention too is, so LibreText has been mentioned as using HP5 and being able to integrate like student interaction with the textbooks. So HP5 is also possible in Pressbooks, and also one thing that if you're deciding between LibreText and Pressbooks, I personally use Pressbooks, but the libraries have paid for like a higher license with Pressbooks, so that we can actually integrate Pressbooks books into a Canvas course. So the documents that I've shared for either one of the lab manuals or the annotated bibliography, all those could actually be imported. You basically export it from Pressbooks and you import that file into a Canvas course, and you could actually have all those chapters show up as like a module in Canvas. And from that point on, you can also add quizzes and stuff, so you can have some interaction within your course by sort of merging both the book and the Canvas course itself. So there's some ways to do that using an environment like Canvas, where most of you are probably already familiar with it. So that might be maybe a little bit less of a learning curve than even learning HP5. So I just want to kind of add that on to the biology conversation there. But any questions about biology at all? So Carolyn says, you bring up a good point. Adoption of OER often comes with a reworking of the course or curriculum. So yeah, that's definitely a component to it. Any other questions about biology and textbooks? All right, so we also have Russell Feldhausen. Did I get that right? All right, Russell, do you want to talk about how you've used OER materials in computer science?
Sure. So in the computer science department, we've developed a lot of open textbooks. A lot of this came from a few years ago. We flipped a lot of our undergraduate classes, and we were working in Canvas. And we found that a lot of things like computer code don't show up really well in Canvas pages. It became a real pain to edit. And so we found a platform called Hugo, which is a static site generator. It does a lot of the same things that Pressbooks and LibreText does. It's a little bit more geared toward the text side. And so it allows us to write textbooks that we can embed code snippets in, we can embed LaTeX math into. And so it gave us a really flexible platform. And so we've been using that in a lot of our undergraduate courses. What I will do on Zoom is I will share a link. I gave a talk at the OER Summit last summer that was basically a 30-minute crash course in how to use Hugo. What we really like about Hugo is it doesn't require a whole lot of technical knowledge, and all of the content itself is written in a language called Markdown. If you've ever worked on GitHub or if you've worked in any technical fields, you're probably somewhat familiar with Markdown, or you've at least seen it. For programmers, it's very comfortable for us. And so with that and a little bit of tools with GitHub, you can host your own e-textbook for free on GitHub in about 30 minutes. And so it's worked really well for us. I do realize that, we're kind of going out on our own and not using any of the other systems that folks at K-State are using, but this has worked really well for us. And so I'll share the link. This is our textbooks website that we shared all of our undergraduates. And so they can go here and find textbooks for some of the earlier classes. We've also got a lot of instructors now that use it for their upper level classes that may not exactly need a textbook, but they need a place where they can put course notes and announcement videos and the syllabus and a few other things. For example, I teach the senior project course, and we found that this is a great way to store that material and keep track of it. And then we can integrate it into Canvas every year. But this becomes our single source of truth, so that every semester, as we keep updating to a new Canvas instance, we can just import this content from the textbook and it's good to go. So that's what we've been using. I'm happy to answer questions about it, or anybody can email me and I can talk offline as well.
Any questions for Russell? One example that's related is Mickey Tobler in the Division of Biology. He teaches a class on evolution, and he actually wrote the textbook for his course in R. I don't see him on the meeting today, I don't think, but I thought that was kind of an interesting example, and he wanted to do that in part because he was having the students use a lot of data sets to actually explore some of the questions they were asking in class about evolution. And developing the whole book in R, like, really kind of made it so the students could actually learn some R coding and also had the data sets already embedded in the textbook itself. So I thought that was a good example and kind of related, but on a very different subject with computer science. So that's good. Caroline, I think I saw your unmute for a second. Do you have a question or comment?
I had a question for Russell. So I love your materials that you guys have created, and I think that's such a great application there with Hero. Have you made those findable and searchable within the open textbook library?
We haven't yet. That's something that we definitely need to do. Now that I think we've reached a level of maturity on some of these textbooks where we'd be willing to get them out there. They've always been Creative Commons licensed, but we really haven't gone to the extra effort of making them widely known that they exist. But it's a good point. That's something we should be looking into.
Yeah, so I'll just put a plug in here. If you're interested in exploring what is already out there, not everything, certainly, as we can see, is in the open textbook library, but there's a lot of things that are there, and I put a link in the chat if you want to explore. And your subject librarians can help with that as well, to help you find content if you're looking to adopt or adapt or create materials. If you have something already that you can pull from, it makes it so much easier than trying to create everything from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And Carolyn, while you still have the floor here, might be a good to introduce you to the Zoom session here, just because not everyone might know you or what your role is and what CADS does. But you want to talk about that for a second?
Sure. I'm Carolyn Jackson, and I am the Scholarly Communications and Open Educational Resources Librarian. And I'm within the Center for the Advancement of Digital Scholarship. Here today also is Gwendolyn Sibley, and she is our copyright librarian. So if you knew Emily, she's the new Emily, only not the OER side, she's the copyright side. So hopefully she is already going great guns there and helping us out a lot on the copyright side of OER. So she's also really good with Pressbooks and HTML. So that has been super helpful. If you are interested in exploring OER, if you want to talk about the grant, we can do that. I'm happy to meet with you. We can do a consultation. And if you want to explore Pressbooks, that's one I can show you around. Brian is kind of handling the LibreText side of things because that's really his specialty. And it's really nice if you're interested in applying for a grant, if we can actually meet and talk about it ahead of time, because there's always questions. That's really hard to put in an application about helping you frame it out and thinking about things and how what things might come together for you in that. I think it's April 14th is the deadline for the spring round of OATI grants. And what else can we say? Just keeping, just to add a little context to open, within the grant, we started out early on helping people just create content, alternative content, right? And so that might be materials that you've created or you've adopted that live within Canvas, right? And one of the things we found is that isn't really sustainable in the long run. And so we would like to move a lot of those materials over onto a more sustainable platform. And so Pressbooks and LibreText are one of the ways that can do that. And so, open, what does open mean? It's really not just living open as in free, but it's open to the greater community as well. That doesn't always happen at once. And as a computer science, you get it to a point where you're then ready to share it. And that's something. So that's Pressbooks and LibreText are great tools. I'm happy to show you around and set you up with an account, or Brian will.
All right. So is there anyone else that wants to, or either has a question for Carolyn, or maybe has a different example of how you've used open textbooks to sort of escape the commercial prepackaged course materials?
Hi, Colby. I'm going to jump in. Mine aren't necessarily open in the way that Carolyn just talked about, in that other people can find them. But one of the things that I found in my CAT community class, it's a first year class, 1 credit. I wrote my own stuff. And one of the things, if we're talking about how to get started, I decided that each week I wanted my students to read a page, and I would write that page. So I wrote one single space page each week that gave them all the foundation that I wanted them to have prior to coming into class discussion that week. And the first time I did this is like, oh my, it's going to take me a minute to do these. And it did take me a little bit of time to do this, but now I just have to kind of adapt them to what I want those to be each semester when I teach that class. So it was really kind of a cool thing. Sometimes I find the issue with having other readings, that are even open access, but someone else wrote them, is they don't necessarily prepare my students for what I want them to do. So by making it a single page, it was something that was easy for me to do. It was easy for my students to read. They would come in and they would know all of that page, because it was pretty realistic that they would do that amount of reading for their 1 credit class. So in terms of getting started, doing something really small like that, even as a supplement to the other stuff that you do in your class, might be really cool. And then have such a wonderful payback on getting your students prepared for what you want them to do in your class.
Yeah, those are good points. And having short reading assignments is definitely a big help. That was actually kind of the impetus for my annotated bibliography. As I noticed, I had a commercial textbook that was relatively cheap. It was like $24, and the students all bought a copy, but none of them read the book. And the reason was the chapters were usually like at least 40 pages long, and it was almost solid text, and the figures were not very great. And I just couldn't get them to read things. And so I switched to using extension publications, as well as like government, like technical bulletins and stuff from like federal agencies or state agencies. And most of those are anywhere from like, I don't know, 2 to at most like 8 pages. And so it actually made it a lot easier for me to flip the classrooms so that we could focus on discussion and actually expect the students to have read the assignment coming in. So that was, I like the idea of having just 1 page even. That it's hard for a student to make an excuse for not reading 1 page. So yeah, that's a good point.
It also, I found it helped me streamline what I really wanted to do in class. So you've got to really kind of make it essential.
That's one of the things that I'm doing with our Spanish 4 OER, is that we have like the content that we're going to be discussing in class. It's like a reading or a video or some kind of like cultural information that we're discussing. And then the grammar support is just there as a support, and it's it links to a separate page, so that it's like, if you're having trouble with some of the forms, that's not something that you have to do. Because I think that a lot of times, like, rather than overwhelm the students with like all of the information, it's like, if you need some more information, here's more information. And that's one of the great things that you can do with OER, is have like support links, and like, so that students can kind of tailor their experience based on their own specific needs, rather than overwhelming with like a lot of information that only a few students need.
So going back to what you were saying, Colby, about readings and being them long readings, and are they really reading it? If you are including auxiliary readings in your course materials, if you have journal articles, if you have a chapter from a book or a section from a book, if you contact your subject librarian, they can help you to get access to that through the libraries. And So for instance, if there's a library book that you want to include a chapter in your course materials, we buy those, usually they're digital these days, right? So, but we have different ways we can buy them. We can buy them where one person at a time can read a book, or we can buy them where maybe 3 people at a time can read them. If your whole class, and it's a big class, want to read it, sometimes we can get unlimited seats to purchase a book. So if you have materials like that you are using as what we call alternative, materials, the librarians can really help you out with that in how we purchase that, and to make sure that everybody can get access who needs to. And so your subject librarian's a good person to contact on that. And some of those books are also purchased through, they're just included in a big package deal that we get. And so we haven't purchased them individually. So when you link to those in your course materials, it's really helpful to use what's called a permalink. And we have a LibGuide instruction on how to do that. Maybe Sarah, you could put that in the chat, a link on how, if you have that on the LibGuide, there is one on how to create a permalink, or I'll do that. So thinking about those auxiliary materials that are alternatives to regular textbook or supplement those, the librarians are really good about helping with that. So
And
to make sure that
might jump in on that one because Carolyn mentioned that we can purchase direct access to an ebook, but some of them do come as part of our packages, like with the ProQuest ebook Central. Those are, how when you're watching a show on Netflix and then it goes away because the publisher changed the agreement with the distributor changed the agreement. So if you are using a book or something like that, any ebook, go ahead and let your librarian, I'm one, know, so we can tell our content development librarians, so we can make that step of purchasing ongoing access to that title so that you're not preparing for a class in the spring semester and January comes and we find out that the publisher took that book off that site. So let us know if it is a book that you're using for a class.
So there's a question in the chat about faculty getting reimbursed for creating OER. And so OER would include textbooks or other supportive materials as well. So at K-State, we do have the Open and Alternative Textbook Initiative, which was plugged earlier. And so those grants, the award amount is up to $5,000. But it kind of scales depending on the size of the class and kind of like the overall proposal that was submitted. But I don't think there's exactly requirements on how things are budgeted. Oftentimes people will actually use those grant dollars to cover like summer salaries, so they can actually spend the time to work on that resource. So that would be one way to get reimbursed, I guess, if that's the way you're putting it. Also, we're getting close on time, but Eva mentioned that she's would like to talk about figures and putting those into open source documents, and actually think that is an important topic. So Eva, do you want to discuss that for a bit?
Yeah, so one of the things I've run into and used to drive me crazy with textbooks is they would have a figure like a cell, and it has absolutely everything labeled in it. And you don't want your students to try to memorize all those labels. You just want them to focus on 1 or 2 things. And so when we redid the book and picked figures for it, I spent a lot of time on Wikimedia trying to find, open source images, and then I would put them in PowerPoint and add labels and then turn that into an image and put it in the book. Or I'd pull it into PowerPoint or Photoshop and like erase some of the arrows and terms and stuff, things that were labeled, and put those in there. And so another thing that I run into, so that was really helpful. And sometimes I draw some of our own figures and put them in. But one of my biggest issues is I find the perfect image and I can't use it because it's on a website. And so I've always wondered about how to deal with that kind of copyright and and attributing those images and getting permission. Do we need to have permission for an open source book? I guess you would. If you're using it on PowerPoint in your classroom, you don't usually. So I'm wondering how all that kind of thing works.
So I attended the Open Education Conference a few years ago when it was still in person. And I attended a talk that was actually talking about a lab manual for introductory biology courses. And what they were doing was what I would call an open pedagogy approach, where they'd have the students operating microscopes, looking at microbes or cells or what have you. And they had those microscopes set up with cameras, and they would take their own images. And so the students are the photographers, so they actually like have the rights to the copyright for that image and so on. And they would have an assignment where the student would have to take that image, they'd label all the parts that were relevant for that assignment, and they would submit that as their particular assignment. But they were also asked to grant the rights to the instructor to incorporate that into the lab manual if it was a particularly good image. And so they would have like a memorandum of understanding that basically kind of gives the instructor the ability to actually use those images, and they'd have to basically kind of license it under some of the Creative Commons license. But those students would be able to actually get credit for those images, but they would still kind of live on. So again, it's another example of an assignment that is not a throwaway assignment. So that might be one way to do it, is actually kind of farm that effort out to the students, so it doesn't all fall on the instructor to do it. But anyone else have any ideas or comments related to developing figures to incorporate into open textbooks?
I can jump in and speak some. Wikimedia Commons is a wonderful place to start, and I think this speaks to the lack of pool of imagery in open access at the moment. I can see we've had trouble where people are linking to images that are open access, but the raw image itself is not available. And so it more becomes a question of quality, in my opinion, that if you're using an image that you would normally have to pay a textbook service to get the high quality version, then you are kind of violating their license by using their lower quality version. So you can use it as in terms of fair use in a lecture setting, but because OER goes out to the wider public as a free resource for everyone that other people can adapt, it is kind of a stretch on what people usually define as fair use. And so there are actually better open access tools like Photoshop that exist. So if you want to work on editing things, but you don't want to pay for Photoshop, the one that I use is called Inkscape, and it is an open access photo editing software, which can make that process easier to do because then you're not paying for more Photoshop.
So how much can you change an image before it's, can you just take all the labels off of an image and use it then because you changed it enough, or is that not enough?
Necessarily. In terms of copyright, facts are not copyrightable, but creativity is. So the image itself, the cell without the labels, is still the creative part of that work. If you were to take the image out and keep the labels, it would no longer be the same image. So in terms of fair use, a court case would have to decide yay or nay, but it tends to lean more towards fair use if it's an enclosed lecture setting. But once it's on the internet downloadable, it becomes less fair use and more distribution. So when you're choosing imagery, it's more thinking about can you add to the pool so that somebody else doesn't have to do this more work in the future? If you're that, altruistic, but if you're trying to work on what you want, seeing what tools are available to you for free that will help with that editing process so that you don't have to spend so much time on it.
So what if it's in something that can't be downloaded, but it's still on the internet?
If it depends on the license they've attributed to. So if they don't have an open access license, then that is not something you should be using for an open access textbook. They could send you a cease and desist letter if they so decided that they didn't want this affiliated with your textbook. Because when you put a book out and you have an open access license attributed to it, unless you specify for every single image that this is not included in the open access license, then that is going to be interpreted as an open access image. And because different open access licenses have different stipulations, like, can someone use this for commercial use? Can someone use this without modifying it? You want to be careful with what kind of license you're taking that imagery from. So I feel like I've complicated your question more than added a solution to it, but I do think Wikimedia Commons is a wonderful place to start. And if you are thinking about creating an OER and you want to see how your work impacts beyond just your course, adding your imagery to Wikimedia Commons, you can see how it's being downloaded, who's taking it, can be a very interesting place for impact analysis.
One source that I use for images a lot was like federal government agency websites, because any image that was produced and released to the general public from a federal agency is in the public domain. And so actually, if you look at the annotated bibliography that I linked to earlier, almost all the images from that were from a photo gallery from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they're all public domain. What was interesting is some of the images would actually be listed. They were taken by federal employees as part of their work, but then they'd be shared on like, say, Flickr or some other like photo repository like that. And they would be licensed in some other way, but actually it's a federal image, and so it still would actually fall in public domain. So it was, I think even federal employees sometimes don't understand how copyright law works in their own roles. But that would be a good place to start, though, is just look for whatever government agency is related to your discipline. There's probably some images somewhere that you could use that are in the public domain. All right, so we have 3 minutes left in the hour. Are there kind of any general questions that people have for anyone else in the group? All right, so if not, I actually have one for Gwendolyn. So Sha-Lin, who's on today, she and I have had a couple of conversations about artificial intelligence, and there's been a couple of recent cases of people using like chatbot or some other AI service to actually write open educational resources, and then they go and publish those things as like their own work, essentially. Sometimes they cite chatbot or sometimes they don't. But how do you see AI and copyright law sort of colliding?
This will probably take longer than 2 minutes, but to put it simply, at our current stage of the law, Congress has decided that AI does not have copyright protection in its generated content. So if you are deciding to use work, you don't necessarily know where that work is coming from. There's still a lot of cases coming out on how these AI have scrubbed other works, the same way we talked about imagery. It may have taken information from somewhere that didn't want it to be taken. And by the time it comes back to you, there's probably nothing that, no court's going to come down and say, oh, well, look what you've done. But I would just be careful in that. Check your sources, see if it's populating something that actually already exists, because it comes off as saying, I've created this, but obviously it's scrubbed from many, many, many sources. And if you are niche enough that you're needing to make an OER for your specific class, then you might be niche enough that it's pulling from the 5 places that exist for this information. And at that point, is it useful to you? I don't know. It's kind of right now, there's a lot of questions in the air, but you're free to experiment as much as you like, but know that because you're creating it, you don't necessarily own it just as much as the AI doesn't. So putting your name on it as the author is kind of questionable in academic settings, but right now you're going to see a lot of interesting people using it in very interesting ways. So I'm kind of excited for it personally.
I expect that it'll probably take about a decade's worth of case law to figure out where we actually land on it. But what if you took something like that and gave it a what do they call it? Like the open access, like 0 license or whatever, where it's like fully public domain.
It's kind of one of those license applications that is kind of a misnomer, because even though you're putting it on there, the AI doesn't have copyright at all. So it's in the public domain, but it's weird because it's not original. AI generated content isn't originally created. It's pulled from other sources. So whether or not we don't have access to the source banks that it's pulling from, presumably all of that stuff is open access, allowed to be used for AI. We might see Creative Commons licenses that stipulate no AI use in the future, because that's going to be on everyone's minds for the coming years, I think.
All right, thank you. So we're 1 minute over the hour. So I'd like to kind of wrap it up there. So, Don, thanks for inviting us back to talk about open textbooks again. Carolyn did put in the chat about more OER content that's coming up this week, Open Education Week. So thank Carolyn for sharing that. Don, do you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, but first of all, I want to thank all of the presenters and the people engaged in the conversation today, and wonderful conversation about doing the right thing in terms of our teaching and doing right by our students. I want to put everyone's attention on next week. We have an event by Melissa Glazer called More Than Kindness: Practical Ways to Support Students with Empathy and Boundaries. I'll remind you that there's a post-event survey that we're going to be dropping in the chat right now, and that you also have the opportunity to get TLC professional development certificates and potentially fellow status by being part of these events. So keep doing the teaching. Please do something for yourself next week over break. At least go a little bit slower and do a little bit less. And we'll pick this up the week after spring break. But thank you all for being here today.